Most of us think we know what a number is. It is simple, neutral, almost boring, a way to count apples, floors in a building, days on a calendar. But then you meet the number 13, and suddenly the mood changes. Hotels quietly erase it from their elevators. Airplanes skip it in their seat rows. Some people will not sign a contract, have surgery, or even leave the house if the calendar and the number align in a certain way. A tiny symbol on a page becomes something else, a kind of warning. So why this number? Why 13 and not 11 or 14 or 19? And why has this particular fear grown so strong that in the United States alone, businesses are estimated to lose as much as $800 to $900 million whenever Friday the 13th rolls around? To answer that, we have to walk into a space where numbers are not just mathematical, where they are charged with stories, with religion, with memory, and with a thin strand of unease that runs through the centuries. We can begin with a simple contrast: 12 and 13. Humans have loved the number 12 for a very long time. In the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Rome, 12 meant completeness. There were 12 months in the year, 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 Olympian gods in Greek tradition, 12 tribes of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, 12 apostles in Christian tradition. At several church councils during the Middle Ages, theologians and canon lawyers would speak quite casually about 12 as a perfect or full number, the kind that makes an ordered universe feel safe. So where does that leave 13? If 12 is completeness, 13 is the step beyond completeness. It is the extra place at the table, the guest who does not quite fit into the seating chart, the one seat too many. That sense of imbalance runs through some of the oldest stories we have. Take Norse mythology. In a tale preserved in later medieval sources, the gods are feasting in Valhalla, and there are 12 of them, as there should be. Then a 13th guest arrives uninvited, Loki. I have always found it striking how ordinary the setup sounds. It could almost be a dinner party in any century until you remember who Loki is. He schemes, he deceives, and by the end of the story, the good and radiant god, Balder, is dead, killed through Loki's trickery. One extra guest, one extra place at the divine table, and the golden age of the gods takes a turn towards disaster. We will return to this idea of the extra guest a little later. Move forward several centuries, and the scene changes to an upper room in 1st century Jerusalem, the Last Supper. Most people know this image from paintings and church windows. 13 men at a table, Jesus and his 12 apostles. Medieval commentators counted them carefully. Some later traditions, especially in Western Europe, suggested that Judas, the betrayer, was seated as the 13th guest. Now, the Bible itself does not say Judas was number 13, and modern scholars are quick to note that this may be more symbolic than historical, but the association stuck. By the late Middle Ages, sermons and devotional writings would occasionally warn against groups of 13 at table, hinting that this might invite misfortune or at the very least remind God of that darkest of dinners. You can see how a pattern begins to form. 12 is harmony. 13 is the intrusion, the moment everything goes off balance. In Norse myth, it leads to a god's death. In Christian tradition, it frames the betrayal that leads to the crucifixion. No wonder that, by the time we reach early modern Europe, the idea that 13 is unlucky is already quietly in place. But here is where it gets complicated. If you look for a single moment when humanity suddenly decided that 13 was cursed, you will not find one. The historian is left instead with scattered hints, and some of them are more fragile than others. For example, you will sometimes hear that the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylonia around 1760 before Christ omits law number 13, as if even those distant lawmakers were afraid of it. The surviving tablets, though, suggest that what we would call Law 13 is simply missing due to a scribal convention or damage, not deliberate avoidance. In other words, the superstition is almost certainly being read backwards onto an ancient text rather than forward from it. That kind of retroactive storytelling happens a lot. Take Friday the 13th itself. One very popular story links it to a specific historical date, Friday, the 13th of October in the year 1307, when King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Knights Templar. It sounds satisfyingly neat, a dramatic royal purge, a shadowy order of warrior monks, a Friday the 13th. More than one modern book and film has used that scene as a kind of origin myth. But when you read church records and royal letters from that time, something uncomfortable happens. No one seems to think that the date itself is cursed. They are interested in property seizures, charges of heresy, and political power, not unlucky calendars. Most historians now argue that connecting this event to the superstition came much later, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the Templars were being reimagined in novels and conspiracy theories. The story is compelling, but the evidence is thin. This is one of those moments where our hunger for a neat explanation runs ahead of the actual documents. In fact, the word triskaidekaphobia itself only appears in the early 20th century, around 1909 to 1911, in psychological and popular writing. Before that, people certainly disliked or avoided 13 in various places and periods, but it did not have a clinical sounding label, and it was not yet the global cultural phenomenon it has become. So, how did we get from scattered medieval anxieties about dinner guests to entire skyscrapers that quietly pretend 13 does not exist? Part of the answer lies in ordinary architecture. Walk into a high-rise hotel or office building in New York, London, or Singapore and look at the elevator buttons. You will often see 12 and then 14, as though the laws of arithmetic had taken a brief holiday. The 13th floor may physically exist, but it has been renamed or folded into another number. Airlines sometimes do something similar, leaping from row 12 to row 14. This is not because engineers are confused. It is a concession to customer feelings. Enough people are uneasy about the number that businesses quietly redesign reality to keep everyone comfortable. Those feelings can have measurable effects. In the United States, researchers and insurers have estimated that on each Friday the 13th, between 17 and 21 million people change their behavior in noticeable ways, avoiding flights, rescheduling surgeries, postponing big purchases. The combined dip in activity is thought to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. A nervous flutter in the human mind, multiplied across a modern economy, becomes something you can plot on a graph. And then, there are the people for whom the number is more than a mild discomfort. Some experience what clinicians call paraskividikatriophobia, a specific fear of Friday the 13th. The term is slightly playful, combining Greek roots for Friday, 13, and fear. But the experience can be serious: anxiety, panic, and elaborate rituals to ward off imagined disaster. The composer Arnold Schoenberg, born in 1874, is a well-documented case. He disliked the number 13 so intensely that he would avoid it in his musical scores, labeling what should have been the 13th measure as 12A. He worried about the years of his life whose digits added up to 13. He died in 1951 on Friday, the 13th of July. For those inclined to see patterns, the irony is hard to resist. More on that in a moment. Not everyone, however, agrees that 13 is bad news. This is where things diverge in a rather interesting way. In some traditions, 13 is a number of blessing. In certain strands of Judaism, for example, 13 can be associated with the age of religious adulthood, or with lists of divine attributes discussed by medieval rabbis. In more recent popular culture, a different kind of counter-tradition has appeared. The singer-songwriter Taylor Swift, born on the 13th of December, has spoken often about treating 13 as her personal lucky number, scrawling it on her hand during concerts and delighting in career milestones that fall on the 13th. To her, 13 is not a threat, it is a charm. What all these examples have in common is not mathematics, but meaning. The human mind is extraordinarily good at pattern seeking. We notice when something significant happens on a Friday the 13th and quietly forget the many, many unremarkable Fridays that arrive without incident. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. We also engage in what they term magical thinking, the tendency to believe that our thoughts, rituals, or the symbols around us can influence events that are, in reality, completely unrelated. Carrying a lucky coin, avoiding a particular date, skipping a floor in a hotel, none of these actions changes the physics of the world, but they can change how we feel moving through it. That tension between reason and unease is not new. In 1881, in New York City, a group of skeptically minded gentlemen founded what they called the 13 Club. Their aim was to mock and, perhaps, cure the superstition. They held dinners on the 13th day of the month, seated exactly 13 people at a table, spilled salt without flinching, crossed under ladders, and generally did everything they could to invite misfortune. Several future presidents of the United States became honorary members, including Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, William McKinley, Benjamin Harrison, and Theodore Roosevelt. The newspapers covered these events with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. The members did not, as far as the records show, die in unusually gruesome ways, and yet, despite their efforts, the superstition did not vanish. If anything, the 20th century gave it a new stage. The term paraskevidikatriophobia began turning up in popular psychology books. In 1980, a low-budget horror film simply titled Friday the 13th brought the date into theaters and living rooms across America. The movie did not create the fear, but it amplified it, tying it to blood and masks and a different kind of mythology. That shows up much lower down when we start to ask why certain numbers become shorthand for an entire mood. Think of 7 for luck, 666 for evil, 13 for the sense that something is not quite right. Now, this may sound like the end of the story, a mesh of ancient myths, medieval theology, modern psychology, and pop culture all wrapped around a simple number, but there is one more layer to this iceberg. At the heart of many of these tales is the table, the gods in Valhalla, Jesus and his disciples in Jerusalem, the presidents and skeptics of the 13 Club in their New York dining rooms. 13 is not just a mark on a page, it is a body in a chair, a presence in a room. To my mind, what unsettles us is not only the mathematics, but the social geometry. Who is the one who does not fit? Who brings imbalance? Who, as in the case of Judas, will betray? Numbers, in these contexts, become a way of counting trust and danger. In a world that often feels unpredictable, there is something oddly comforting about believing that the danger can be contained in a simple symbol. Avoid this date, do not stay on this floor, do not invite this many guests. It gives us the illusion of control, and sometimes that illusion feels better than admitting that life is, in many ways, random. So why do we fear the number 13? Because we inherit stories of gods and betrayers, of feasts gone wrong, and councils of theologians who worried about order and chaos. Because our minds are tuned to find patterns, even when the statistics say there is nothing there. Because architects, airline designers, and filmmakers all, in their own ways, nod to the superstition, reinforcing it every time we step into an elevator and see the number quietly missing. And perhaps, at a deeper level, because we want the world to be readable. If misfortune is tied to a number, then maybe it is not entirely senseless. Maybe there is a code we can crack, or a ritual we can perform, or a seat we can refuse to keep disaster at bay. In the end, 13 is only a number, but it is also a small mirror reflecting how we weave faith, fear, and meaning into the most ordinary parts of life. We turn dates into omens, floor numbers into talismans, dinner parties into dramas of loyalty and betrayal. The stories we tell about our numbers say as much about us as they do about the symbols themselves. As you step into your next elevator or look at your next calendar, you might notice whether 13 is there or whether it has been politely erased. Either way, the superstition only has the power we collectively give it. Thank you for spending this time tracing the strange history of an apparently simple number. Until next time, take care and count or do not count 13 as you will.